The Act was originally designed to stop people importing endangered species in other countries. The environmentalists have added to this a whole series of species of trees, some of which are actually not endangered. They're just ones which they, in their own view, should not be touched, and therefore have created this legal opportunity, which is a clear example of over-criminalisation, to penalise somebody who has actually imported a product and imported it and embraced it into a US-made product, like the guitar, and because that's a product which the Lacey Act can be interpreted as saying you mustn't use that product, that person can then be charged and in some cases jailed. It's pernicious. The question as to whether it's an improvement for the environment needs to be examined because it depends on what your judgment is. WWF will say it is not permissible for anybody to cut down one more tree, regardless of whether or not a country might have already set 25 or 50% of its land mass aside with forestry which is not to be touched. In other words, they're not at all interested in the real environmental question in this case, which is why do you leave areas of forest? You want to preserve the biodiversity. The other area you mark out for economic growth and development, there's no reason why that shouldn't be touched. So this is not actually an environmental position. This is a, well, sometimes we jokingly call it tree hugging. It's almost an aesthetic value. But there are other consequences of this, of course. First of all, the product is going to be more expensive to the consumer. But in developing countries, or even in industrialised countries, often this will result in putting brakes on the development of an industry which creates jobs, generates prosperity, and increases the wealth of the country. That's the real cost. As far as the business is concerned, it naturally limits the ability of businesses to expand, to make profits and generate growth. Definitely, we're seeing it in the European Commission, we're also seeing it in Congress. The pattern here is that we're seeing alliances between environmental groups, in some cases organised labour, and in some cases companies who are unable to compete with cheaper products being imported, and they're coming together to impose trade restrictions which they're trying to justify on sustainability grounds. It's what we'll call green protectionism. We're seeing it again in some of these product areas that we've seen WWF active. So in the EU, they've now imposed trade restrictions on imports of biofuels, that's from the United States or from anybody else. Now the interesting thing is when you look at the restriction, they'll let some in but not some others. Now being an old trade hand, someone said to me one day they couldn't work out what explained the gap, how do they work out the size? And I said, I think if you have a look at how much domestic production the competing EU product can produce, the gap between that and what the market might need will be what they'll allow in, because the EU for a long time has regulated its agricultural trade in this way. So we are now starting to see this pattern being pushed in the EU. We're seeing the groups here trying to push this sort of thing up in the Congress, and we're seeing it in other administrations. So they're pushing forward this idea that unless the product meets a sustainability standard, then it should be restricted. Now, the interesting thing is that the WTO rules are very clear on this. And there's been 2 or 3 recent cases where the issue has gone to the panel, and there's a general proposition of the WTO which says you can't restrict a product on environmental grounds if it is unnecessarily restrictive on trade, and if it only has an indirect impact on the environmental problems it's trying to fix. So for example, another example would be, like Lacey, would be to say, we may pass a law saying we're not going to allow anybody to import something which is illegally produced in another country. They've talked about forestry typically. WTO says no, the import authorities must be blind to how the product's made. That's an issue for the national administration in the countries which it's produced. So here we're seeing this as a cutting edge. So we're seeing a pretty broad push by these environmental groups, not only to use sustainability standards to try to restrict trade, but from our discussion that we've seen before, you can also see they're now also trying to restrict the way domestic markets operate. Often WWF likes to describe itself as the good cop. The bad cop will be Greenpeace or the Rainforest Action Movement. And what we have seen is a strategy where companies with very valuable brand names are attacked publicly and their brand name besmirched. And then the suggestion is, well, if you adopt the WWF standard, we'll leave you alone. This is the process of transforming markets. It's pretty ugly.